Hey, violists out there and viola fans, welcome to Viola Studio Mental Health Week, hosted by the Viola Studio at the University of Iowa, our annual event. So, this is the first of a few very casual videos I'm making. So, you have to pardon the background noise and the dogs barking and user error. But the first podcast or that I'd like to offer is observations on Baroque performance practice for string players. And this is something that comes up in lessons all the time and that I've given a lot of talks about at various conferences. Um, Now, you don't have to be an expert in Baroque performance practice in order to be a thoughtful player of Baroque music, and you don't have to be a scholar of any kind or read every book. But there are a few things that you can do that can make yourself more informed, and there is a formal term called historically informed performance, a term that was coined, I believe, by the musicologist John Butt, who has wonderful writings about Baroque performance. Um, so just being sensitive. So the first thing about Baroque performance that is the most different, and this is I'm talking about on the difference between a modern instrument and bow and a Baroque instrument and bow, is the concept of sound. So the on this instrument, in this bow, this instrument was developed for projection and power. So to be able to be heard in the back of a concert hall, and to be clear. So there's a lot of tension on the strings, and the same with the bow, a lot of tension on the hair, and it made so that it can sustain all the way to the tip with a uniform sound. Um, in the Baroque era, and if you try a Baroque bow, the big difference is, well, one is the gut strings, and they're very loose or much looser than on the modern because of the angle of the neck. So it doesn't get a lot to take a lot to get that string to speak. And the Baroque bow isn't as tight as this one because of the curve here. And so as you're playing, it's a very natural decay of sound. Not to say you can't do one or the other on each instrument, it's just not as natural to do. So, with that in mind, when you're playing the beginning of note in Baroque music, you're not going to be attacking it with a big attack like we're used to in modern music, or even on a smaller scale. That's a very clear attack, and I would call that to be gentle in modern playing. But in Baroque music, I would be I'd lean in on that a little bit more. I sometimes describe it to my Baroque violin and viola students as you're a goose landing in water, and you come down with your feet first in the water, and you just sort of glide into the water, and that's what it feels like with a Baroque bow. And so that sound aesthetic, we don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg. Was it the bow that influenced the sound, the instrument and the bow, or was it the aesthetic of the time that influenced the crafting of the instrument and the bow and the materials that were used in both? We don't really know. um, there's another thing with the bow in Baroque music that we don't use so much in modern, and is something called messa di voce. In Italian, means under the voice or half the voice. So excuse me, sottovoce is under the voice. Messa di voce, half the voice, and that is the what when I studied at the Oberlin Baroque Performance Institute, they called it the whale note, and it can be overused to the point of nausea. So you want to be careful not to use that. That effect is most effective when you're approaching a note, or you're in a note and it comes to a point where it's overlapping on dissonance, such as a suspension, um, things like that. And it's an ornament that helps you bring out the dissonance of the note and making it interesting. But not every note is messa di voce. Now, a performer in the Baroque era would have been expected to have a wide set of skills that we don't have today. We have a different set of skills. We play music from in one day. We can music that was played 300 or 400 years ago to music that was written yesterday. And during the Baroque era, usually the oldest music that they were playing was something that was written by a generation before, or the teacher of the Kapellmeister, or the whoever was conducting the orchestra. So we don't expect you to know so much. And that's why when you look at Baroque music and in my editions, I don't include a lot of dynamic markings, especially because the performer would have known what dynamics could have been played and should have been played. It's based on tempo, the type of music it is. It's a dance, what the affect is, the character, and what the function of a part of the music is. Is a part of musical sequence or an echo, things like this. So a lot of that was not written in. Dynamics didn't really become standard until Beethoven and after. And also same thing with bowings and tempo markings. The performer would know what to do from their training and what. So we take into consideration these things. And I'll talk about good taste in a little bit and how that really affects your choices. So let's start with, you have to know your bass line. That's the most important thing. Even in solo Bach, there might not be an overt bass line, but there's always an implied bass line. And that is the governing force of the music, whether we hear it or not. It dictates the tempo, the affect, the articulation, rhythmic stress, phrasing, dynamics, all of that stuff. So know your bass line. Another sort of rule that we have, or guiding principle, I guess I should say, is about stepwise motion or conjunct motion in a line that is music that's separated by a step, either whole or half, is usually played in a connected manner. Disjunct motion or disconnected parts, arpeggiated figures, those notes are usually played a little bit shorter, a little bit more separated. Pickups are connected to the next note. A lot of times I'll tell my students, don't romanticize the pickup. By that, here's the Allemande from the second cello suite. And it's so easy because it's a really emotional, involving piece to go. That's what I call a romanticized pickup. This pickup is a 16th note going to the downbeat, and it should go to the downbeat. And so on and so forth. And then the same thing goes when you're inside the piece. I'll go to bar 8 if you're following. Did you know that little pickup? Here's a romanticized pickup. Now that one's another story. I wouldn't mind that pickup being a little bit fatter. But these are just generalizations. So when you're playing a syncopated line, that is notes da ba ba ba, you always want to put a little bit of separation between those notes. Don't play them smoothly. In fact, in Baroque music, silence is a very important factor. So notes aren't always connected like glue that we're used to in our modern player. If the composer doesn't put in an articulation or a rest, we play straight through. Baroque music, not so much. You don't have to hold the note its full value. But syncopations, you always want to put some kind of little space before each syncopated note. Now, I talked about affect, which is the German word, means character, mood. This was a really important factor in Baroque music, in that the emotional content had to be conveyed by the performer. And if it wasn't, it was considered an unsuccessful performance. And contemporary writing about how to play music always mentions this, that the performer is this conduit to the emotion of the music, of the emotion of the music. And so that's extremely important. That's also a factor that will help you decide a lot of things like dynamics, tempo, and other factors. So keep that in mind. And sometimes what looks like a tempo indication in music is more of an affect indication. So allegro doesn't necessarily mean fast. It means usually light, happy, springy. Not always, but now the concept of strong and weak beats is very important in Baroque music. We're taught, at least the way I was taught, and I think a lot of us are taught or we're taught, is that down and up should be equal. And we spend a lot of time on etudes learning how to do that. And yes, it's really important. But in Baroque music, that wasn't expected. There's a lot written to that. It reinforces that. So the down bow. Now, this is a very French concept. It's called the rule of down bow. It was developed in France in the Baroque era. And a lot of musicians around the world, the Western world, obeyed this. The Italians had a little different idea. Gimignani writes in his one of his books that the wretched rule of down bow, I think is what he calls it. But in Baroque bowing, the down bow is almost literally down. The instrument was held more in the front, and you drop your arm, you're really going down, and then up, you're going up. The French terms for down and up bow translate to pull and push. So the heavy beats, strong beats in a piece are usually down bow. Light beats, up bow. Pickups are always up bow unless there's a good reason not to do it. But you can go by that rule. Down bow on strong beats or within a phrase where the strong beats come, and then up bows. Now, something that I always talk about when my students learn Bach is how do you play chords? So we all have instances. In fact, I'm in that D minor. I'm going to do what I call a reverse roll. I took some lessons with Stanley Ritchie, and he abhors this. He hates it. He says there's two modern chords. A lot of times players will go the 2-2, which works great for Rager, but for Bach he didn't like that. And then he said if you have a combination of the two, it's called takachu, like you're sneezing in reverse. That's a takachu. So this idea of always starting chords from the bottom note it's a modern concept that's gleaned from contemporary writing during the Baroque period and classical eras. But it goes along with what I had said before, that the overriding factor in making decisions about Baroque music is that bass line. It's the integrity of the music. It's everything really about the music, whether you want to believe it or not. So if we reverse roll, what we're doing is we're saying that's the most important note, and that the other notes, they're kind of whipped down. It sounds like grace notes. So we want to acknowledge that the bottom note is where the harmony is changing. Imagine if, well, we have solo Bach, no basso continuo, but almost all Baroque music had a basso continuo. And so the bass player, the boss, would be changing their bass notes, their rhythms, with the change of the player. So you would be off from the bass player. So you want to make sure that's where a basso continuo is placing their downbeat. It's up to you, the performer, then, to how you roll the note and how much time you spend on certain notes. That's going to tell the listener what the important note is here. This is a little bit of a weird example because the melodic line is in the middle. So I can cheat a little bit there. Not cheat, but let go of the top notes slightly to show where that melodic line is. Or you can, there are many ways to do it, but you need to show the important place, which is the change in the bass, and not to make those grace notes. The bottom note should land on the beat. That's hard for people to wrap their head around, including myself when I first learned this. But once you do it, it solves a lot of problems about timing and rhythm. We're always going to hear the top line as being the top. So if it's melodic, even if it's delayed slightly, we put a gap in it, the ear is always going to hang on to the melodic line. So we don't have to worry so much about that. So playing chords on the beat, super, super important. Now I have an example here. I'm going to share my screen with you. And here is an example. This is an old one. I've changed a few things, so some things need to be updated, but for the purpose of this exercise, this is the idea that we don't, remember when I talked about silence, you don't have to hold a note, it's complete sustain or complete printed value on the page. It's not important to do that. It's important for the notes to fall on the correct place, the big beats to land in the right place. So if you were playing, this is a example from the second cello suite here, the saraband. So we have a quarter note followed by a 16th note in the top. So what happens sometimes, and I hear this a lot, is so what I've done there is I'm making sure that every note is filled and I'm doing the printed bowing. But if you notice the bottom line, I've completely changed the rhythm. The bottom line, the bass line of this chaconne, that has to be preserved. And there are a couple ways that you can do that. One is to do what I just did, which is to shorten the value of the bass line. So it's landing where it needs to, but it's not sustained all the way. Or I can slur. So technically, I'm not changing the rhythm of the bass line, but it sounds odd. It's a little bit odd. And so the player would not be expected to be an exact replicator of that rhythm. So here's another example, measures 13 and 14. So that's the way I would play that. I've preserved the integrity of the top line, the rhythm, that voice, and the bottom line. So this is how I hear it sometimes. Excuse me. Sometimes. So I played the middle variation, but now the bottom is I could slur it too. So you can do that too. As Quantz would say, who wrote a whole book on this, you can follow all the rules, but in the end, good taste should prevail. So let's go on here to the next idea. Fingerings in all of Bach's music, there are, I think, an example of maybe 2 fingerings in his parts. It's one is in the violin, solo violin pieces, and it's probably in his handwriting. So we don't know why it's in there. But that's another thing. Performers during that era wouldn't need to know fingerings because they were taught, the rule of fingering. And so you would, first position, lower positions were the default setting. Even though Bach's music is very technical, that wasn't typical of the time. Most music didn't quite go up that high. But when it does in Bach's writing, and also Bieber Passacaglia, another virtuosic piece, you don't shift. Once you get to a passage, you try and stay there the whole time. And the way it's written, you can do that in Bach. Open strings are very, very okay, but it depends on who you ask. If you read Leopold Mozart's book about violin technique, he does not like open strings. So it's, again, a matter of taste and where you grew up, what town, so on and so forth. And in Baroque music, since they didn't use the chin holding the instrument down, makes shifting a little bit more difficult. You can shift close by, and then big shifts, you can use your chin to anchor. So trying to stay in a position for a passage, avoiding shifts underneath slurs, things like that. And it's very possible in a lot of places, sometimes impossible. Another fingering thing to keep in mind, if you have a passage, this is a French term called bariolage, and it's the rapid alternating of 2 notes. It's a string technique, 2 notes, one of which is usually an open string. The first cello suite. So that's bariolage. But when you have back and forth, and sometimes people will choose fingerings that takes away the bariolage by, instead of playing an open string, using a 4, and then the notes are together on the string. And you don't want to do that. If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, sounds like a duck, smells like a duck, it's a duck. So it's bariolage. Now, tuning practices. In the Baroque period, there were so many different ways of tuning. And I'm talking about pitch tuning. And it was based on where you were, what church, what court, what country, because the organ or the keyboard part will be tuned very specifically. And the pitch of the A varied wildly. We have writing that shows that the A could be as high as 445 and 460, and lower than 415. And so when you went to a church and the keyboard was tuned to that pitch, you would have to adjust. And we have some orchestra parts in Bach, for Bach too, where you can see that the strings were scored or attuned to a different key, so they didn't have to readjust their tuning drastically. So where you were dependent on what pitch. Now, modern people, not right now, but we could be in Paris tonight to play a concert. And so it'd be really hard if we were starting at 415 and then we went to Paris and we had to tune to 450. It would be hard for the instrument to make that adjustment quick enough. So I don't know what is a panel of whoever, it wasn't. But the modern Baroque A default tuning is A415, which is equivalent to our today G sharp. And that can vary too. The classical default A that most period performers stick to is A425. I think a lot of it had to do, who knows, and intonation systems weren't really solidified until the introduction and general acceptance of French woodwind instruments, Baroque, or excuse me, oboe, flute, bassoon, that were starting when they were manufactured, had started to have a more standard uh, intonation and pitch. And so that kind of grew into the standardization of pitch. It's all about globalization. So local didn't matter, but as soon as you start to expand your horizons, you're going to have to come to some agreement. And playing at 415, I enjoyed a lot. I don't do it on the modern viola. You can, but this instrument is built for tension. And on my Baroque viola, I usually A415 when I'm playing on that. Now, ornaments. There's a whole other video that I'm going to do on ornaments. So I won't spend too much time talking about that right now. But there are two, if you're not going to listen to that or watch that video, there are a couple important sources that you can refer to that give you a great idea about ornamentation. Now, there were two styles of playing in the Baroque era in Europe, and one was Italian and one was Baroque. Those were the two styles. In Germany, they embraced both, or stile mix, which is a mix of the two styles. Bach wrote in both Italian and French, and he mixed them too. So thus the name, or you could see the violin sonatas and partitas. The partitas are very French, whereas the sonatas, excuse me, Italian, where the sonatas are more French in general. And French ornamentation and Italian are very, very different. French is extremely ornamented and shown by the composer. A lot of times will show exactly what they want, whereas Italian is a little less specific. So the main thing is that ornaments almost always fall on the beat, because the most important aspect of ornamentation is to bring out the dissonance. Dissonance is interesting. Consonance is nice, but it's that dissonance that we want to bring out and really emphasize. So when you're approaching a cadence, let's say, for instance, I have a trill D note, cadencing in C major. And it's just a whole note with a trill. So there are a lot of things you can do and you should do instead of that's what's on the page. But the composer, especially at a cadential trill like this, a major ending point, you would put a very long trill. And the technical rule about trill lengths is that they are half the value of the note to which they are paired with. So here it's a trill on a D. So the auxiliary note is the E. That's the dissonant note. And we're going to, since it's cadential, we're going to start from the dissonant note and we're going to cut it in half. So that's what I would play. You could do it. So I started the trill a little bit earlier. So resolving, and then added terminal notes, those two little short notes at the end. So when we get to ornaments, we'll talk in more depth about that. Now, something that's really important that is not, it doesn't happen a lot, is when you're learning a piece, know as much as you can about the source that you're using. If it's a source you just found on ISMLP, or was in your grandmother's music collection that you played, who was the editor? When was it printed? What were the editorial processes that were used? Some explanation. But often what you can do is just go, you can do your own research, especially with the internet. And Bach, you can just go to the Bach archive online and see any manuscript in his hand or manuscript copies by contemporary copyists, and download them in a PDF version and see them in great detail. So then you can see that. Now, the idea of an urtext source, there's no such thing as urtext. Urtext, that term um, refers to the closest you can get to the composer's intentions. How do we know unless we have a seance? Um, but with Bach and the cello suites, we don't know because there is no manuscript copy in his hand. So we can't get, the closest we can get to are some copies made during his lifetime. And there are a lot of questions that can be asked about that. But if you go to, there's some wonderful editions. And if you read the beginning and see what the editor, what their processes were for editing, how did they draw their information? Was it just, oh, it felt good, which is what a lot of performers editions have done traditionally. I call them, they're really good for lining your bird cage. Or you can see, a good, very well edited performance edition will be that the editor has made some choices for you and they tell you why they made those choices. And hopefully they're using resources to try and be as faithful as they can. That's one of my neighbors. So, and if you can, get a copy or get a Baroque bow or instrument and try it. The University of Iowa, we have a wonderful collection of violins and violas and bows and some cello bows. We only have one Baroque cello, but just the bow. It doesn't have to be a great one. You can get one on eBay for fairly and cheaply. And you will see right away, it's going to tell you a lot if you listen to it about how it likes to play, what kind of bow strokes it likes to do. It doesn't want to play really short, harsh, or really crisp. I don't want to say crisp, but like the modern bow, it has a little TNT little explosion at the beginning. The Baroque bow doesn't want to do that because of its construction. So I hope you found this video helpful and that you've learned something. And if you would like to have a copy of some of this, or if you want a bibliography, I'd be happy to share that with you. Bye.